If I asked you to name the most important weapon of World War II, most people would say the atomic bomb. Some might say the tank, the bomber, or the aircraft carrier. And those are all reasonable answers. But today I want to tell you about a weapon so small, you could hold it in your hand. A weapon so secret that the American government classified it for years after the war ended. A weapon that military historians believe changed the outcome of dozens of critical battles. And I can almost guarantee that most people watching this right now have never heard of it. It was called the proximity fuse. And by the time this video is over, I think you will agree with me that it belongs right alongside the atomic bomb as one of the most game-changing military inventions in all of World War II. But it is just one piece of a bigger story I want to tell you today about the hidden weapons that most history books barely mention. To understand why the proximity fuse was such a revolution, I first need to explain the problem that military engineers had been struggling with for generations. Shooting down a moving airplane with an artillery shell is one of the hardest things in warfare. Think about what you are actually trying to do. You are firing an explosive shell at an object moving at hundreds of miles per hour, at an altitude of thousands of feet, in 3 dimensions, from the ground below. Before the proximity fuse existed, anti-aircraft shells had to be timed to explode at a specific altitude. Gun crews would calculate how long the shell would take to reach a certain height, set a tiny mechanical timer on the shell's fuse, and hope that when the shell reached that height, an enemy plane would be close enough to be damaged by the explosion. As you can probably imagine, this was extremely difficult to get right. During the early years of World War II, estimates suggested that anti-aircraft crews needed to fire anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 shells for every enemy aircraft they actually brought down. That is an enormous amount of ammunition being wasted for a very small result. And as Germany and Japan developed faster and more maneuverable aircraft, the problem was only getting worse. Something had to change, and American scientists were given the job of changing it. The proximity fuse was developed in the United States beginning around 1940 in a top-secret program run through an organization called the National Defense Research Committee. The basic idea sounds almost impossibly simple when you say it out loud. What if instead of trying to time an explosion perfectly, you made the shell itself aware of how close it was to its target? What if the shell could detect the presence of an aircraft nearby and trigger its own explosion automatically at exactly the right moment? To do this, the scientists crammed a tiny radio transmitter and receiver into the nose of a standard artillery shell. As the shell flew through the air, it sent out a continuous radio signal. When that signal bounced back off a nearby aircraft, the change in the signal triggered the detonator. The shell would explode within lethal distance of the target without anyone having to time anything. The shell did the thinking itself in a fraction of a second while traveling at enormous speed. Now, you might think, how hard can it be to put a tiny radio inside a shell? But the engineering challenges here were almost unimaginable. The shell had to withstand the crushing force of being fired from a gun, a force of about 20,000 times the pull of gravity. The electronics inside had to survive that launch, then function perfectly in flight, and then trigger the explosion at exactly the right moment. Everything had to be small enough to fit inside a standard shell casing, and it had to work reliably. In rain, in cold, at high altitude, in salt air over the ocean. It took hundreds of scientists and engineers years of work to make it happen, but they did. The proximity fuse was first tested in combat in January 1943 from a United States Navy cruiser in the Pacific. A Japanese aircraft was approaching the ship on an attack run. The anti-aircraft crew fired shells fitted with the new proximity fuses. The plane was destroyed. The crew had no idea they had just used one of the most important new weapons of the war. To them, it just looked like they had made a very good shot. The results that followed in the Pacific were stunning. Ships armed with proximity fuse shells became dramatically more effective at shooting down incoming Japanese aircraft. In some engagements, the number of shells needed to bring down an enemy plane dropped from over 1,000 to just a few dozen. The fuse was multiplying the effectiveness of every anti-aircraft gun it was used with by factors that seemed almost impossible to believe at first. The American military was so protective of this technology that they had very strict rules about where proximity fuse shells could be used. For a long time, they were only allowed over water, never over land. The fear was that if a shell failed to explode and landed on the ground in enemy territory, German or Japanese engineers could recover it, study the technology, and potentially develop their own version. The proximity fuse was considered so valuable that America was willing to restrict its own use of it just to keep it secret. Everything changed in December 1944 when Germany launched its last great offensive of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. Germany threw over 200,000 soldiers into a massive surprise attack through the dense forests of the Ardennes in Belgium and Luxembourg. It was the largest single battle American forces fought in the entire war, and in the early days, things looked very dangerous for the Allies. American commanders made a decision in that desperate moment that they had been holding back for years. They authorized the use of proximity fuse shells against ground targets on land for the first time. The results were immediate and devastating for the attacking German forces. When a proximity fuse shell exploded in the air just above troops in the open, the blast and fragmentation came straight down, killing and wounding soldiers who might have been protected by lying flat on the ground or hiding behind cover that would stop a normal shell exploding at ground level. German soldiers who survived the Battle of the Bulge later described the new American artillery as unlike anything they had experienced before. Shells that seemed to explode just above their heads, with nowhere to hide and no way to take cover that helped. Military historians credit the widespread use of proximity fuse shells as one of the critical factors that helped stop the German offensive and eventually push it back. A weapon that had been held in reserve for years proved its value at exactly the moment the Allies needed it most. The proximity fuse was remarkable, but it was not the only hidden weapon that quietly shaped the outcome of the war. Radar, the ability to detect aircraft, ships, and submarines using radio waves, was another technology that changed everything in ways most people still do not fully appreciate. Both Britain and America developed radar systems during the war, and the advantage it gave the Allies was enormous and lasting. Before radar, detecting an incoming enemy air attack depended on human spotters on the ground with binoculars, or on the sound of aircraft engines. By the time you could see or hear enemy planes, they were already very close. With radar, defending forces could detect incoming attacks when enemy planes were still 50, 100, or even more miles away. That gave fighter pilots and anti-aircraft crews precious minutes to get ready that they simply did not have before. In the Battle of Britain in 1940, radar was arguably the single most important reason Britain survived the German air campaign. The Royal Air Force was outnumbered and flying almost constantly, with pilots dangerously exhausted. But radar allowed British commanders to know exactly where German attacks were coming from and sent fighters to meet them efficiently, rather than keeping planes patrolling everywhere at once. Germany had nothing comparable in terms of an integrated early warning system. That difference in information was the difference between survival and defeat for Britain in those critical months. The hidden weapons that helped America win World War II were hiding in plain sight all along. The proximity fuse turned anti-aircraft artillery from a mostly ineffective weapon into a deadly one. Radar gave the Allies an information advantage that changed the outcome of entire campaigns.